Now that you have some background on the impact of diseases both in the past and in the present, now I'm going to give you an introduction to insect vector diseases. First of all, we need to actually define what is a disease. And this really depends upon the textbook that you refer to. But for this case, since we have an introductory course, we're going to define a disease as a stress condition produced by the effects of a pathogen on a susceptible host. And the pathogen is actually what causes the disease or what causes the illness, okay? And you have a susceptible host. And so this applies to insect vector diseases. It applies to the bacteria, viruses that cause us to be ill. And it really depends upon the susceptibility of the host. You can have two different people exposed to the same pathogen, and in some cases, you'll have full onset of a particular disease because that person was very susceptible. In other cases, someone will not really even realize that they're sick, even though they have the presence of that pathogen in their system. So a disease is a stress condition produced by the effects of a pathogen on a susceptible host. Some other key terms that you should know related to diseases are pathology. And this is actually the study of disease. And then we also have epidemiology, which is more specific, focusing on the study of the incidence, distribution, and determinants of a disease in a population. A couple other terms related to epidemiology that would be important to know is an endemic. And this refers to a disease being native to a region or a population. An epidemic refers to a disease outbreaks affecting a high proportion of the population. And so we would say that in many parts of the world, malaria is endemic and it's also an epidemic, okay? Because it's native to that region and there's a high proportion of the population that is affected by that particular disease. Now, when we talk about the endemic, malaria was endemic at one point in time to the United States. We're very fortunate to have this disease eradicated at this point in time. In order for a disease to be prevalent in the environment, three things must be available, and we would refer to these as three agents when we talk about insect vector diseases. The first would be the pathogen. We already mentioned that the pathogen actually causes the disease. With insect vector diseases, you actually need a vector, and many times this vector is going to be a blood-feeding insect, such as a mosquito. In order for it to be a very successful vector, it needs to have a high degree of association with humans. So let's take a look at ticks versus mosquitoes and talk about which one is going to be the better vector in this case. Well, when we take a mosquito, it definitely meets the major requirement in that it does have a high degree of association with humans. It's very, very difficult to go out in the summer and in the fall in the evenings and not encounter a mosquito. Okay, they're going to have a high degree of association. The other thing about mosquitoes is that they're going to be highly mobile. When we take a look at ticks, generally you're going to have to go into the environment that the ticks are present in, tall grasses, those types of things, in order to encounter them. So they wouldn't necessarily have this high degree of association with the humans. Ticks are also going to be very immobile, okay? So mosquitoes are going to be more mobile. They have the ability to fly, where ticks are pretty much going to hang out on that grass leaf blade or up in that tree where they're found at. And so they're not very mobile. The other thing is when you look at the number of hosts, mosquitoes feed on multiple hosts in an hour's time, whereas a tick basically finds a host and it would like to stay on that host until it completes a certain aspect of its development. And so generally it has fewer hosts during its life cycle. And the more hosts you have, the more opportunity the mosquito has to come in contact with the pathogen. And once it does come in contact with the pathogen, the more opportunities that there are to spread that to more hosts. So if we were looking at the standpoint of which would be a better vector, it would definitely be a mosquito, again, because of its high degree of association with humans, its mobility, and then having multiple hosts. And then finally, the last agent that you need is a host. And what we're going to learn about that for many cases, this might be a human host or it may be an actual animal, another animal serving as a host. Now let's talk a little bit about how do insects actually transmit pathogens. Well, there's really two forms. The first one is mechanical transmission, and this is really a passive form of transmission, and we can think about this in particular with flies and cockroaches. Think about that housefly. That housefly happens to be out around a dumpster. It's feeding out in that dumpster area, crawling all around, and it's got all these hairs on its body. It's got these foot pads, these types of things. And as it's touching the different things in the trash can, it's picking these pathogens up on its hair, on its legs, these types of things. It then an hour later enters into your home, and you're sitting down at the table having a sandwich, and this fly happens to land up on your sandwich while you're up getting a drink of water. In this process, as it's trying to figure out whether or not your sandwich is a good food source, it's tapping its legs, it's having a little taste, it's rubbing its body, these types of things. And in this process, any of these pathogens that it's picked up on its body now have been transferred onto your sandwich. You come back, maybe if the fly is there, you kind of shoo it away, but I doubt if many of us actually throw that sandwich away. Hence, we then eat it. Any of those types of pathogens now are ingested into our system, and some can make us sick. Some we have resistance to, and so we don't even notice it. But that would be an example of mechanical transmission. Now, the other form of transmission is biological transmission. And this is the one that we referred to on the last slide, where you're going to have a blood-feeding organism, blood-feeding vector, and the pathogen is going to need that vector in order to move from host to host. And in this case, actually, the pathogen not only needs it to move from host to host, but it also needs it in order to complete some aspect of its development. And so the pathogen will either increase or develop within the vector. And so many times it needs it to complete part of its life cycle. Diseases have sexual stages, and so it might need the vector in order to complete the sexual stage of its development. And so a typical example of an insect that passages pathogens through this biological transmission would be mosquitoes. Again, biological transmission, the pathogen requires transfer by the vector. It's going to be a blood-feeding insect. And the third point is that the pathogen actually needs that vector in order to complete some aspect of its life cycle. Okay, now that you have an overview of what pathology is, epidemiology, and endemic and epidemic, and you also understand the basic disease triangle, those agents that were needed, such as the pathogen, the vector, and the host. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about some insect-vectored diseases. There are a number of diseases that are vectored by insects, or actually the pathogen that causes these diseases are vectored by insects and other arthropods. We can go down the list: malaria, encephalitis, yellow fever, Chagas disease, one in the tropical area, dengue. We see bubonic plague. We've already mentioned that with regard to fleas. West Nile virus. This is a whole listing of these, and it's not necessary that you memorize all of these diseases. But what we're going to do over the next couple of modules or lectures is we're going to focus on malaria and West Nile virus. So we've looked at what are some of the insect vector diseases. Now let's take a look at what are some of the vectors. The vectors are primarily going to fall in the order Diptera. You have your mosquitoes, your black flies, your tsetse flies, you have deer flies, sand flies, those types of things. But we also see fleas belonging to a different order that can be a vector of disease. We see lice, we've mentioned that in the past, and then we also see an assassin bug. And if you recall on the last slide, I mentioned the Chagas disease. And we talked about Chagas disease when we talked about the order Hemiptera. This is a little true bug here. And then the pathogens. These can be viruses, they can be, in most cases, bacteria are common ones, and then some of the protozoans, also very important when we talk about malaria, and then just a few other types of pathogens that can actually cause disease in an organism. But again, it's not necessary to actually go through and learn all these different types of diseases, vectors, and pathogens. I just want to make you aware of the wide variety of them with regard to the pathogen, the vector, and the disease. And now we're going to focus in and talk about malaria and West Nile virus specifically.